Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, The Operational Reality of Statewide Data Ambitions and Exploration of Three Models, Part 2, Centralized and Decentralized Models. My name is Amy. I'm the Membership Associate here at National States Geographic Information Council. If you are unfamiliar with our organization, NSGIC exists to advance the effective national coordination of geospatial information by supporting state-level cooperation. We serve as a national forum for the development of capable and future-oriented geospatial leadership. If you'd like to learn more info on how to get involved with us, please visit our website, www.nsgic.org. With that, I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Kate Hickey and Bill Johnson of AppGeo. I will now turn it over to the presenters.
All right, thank you, Amy. Before I get into quick introductions on our side, I'll mention, this says part 2. Part 1 was actually a very brief on-demand presentation offered at the NSGIC Annual. I think that's probably still accessible. And in that presentation, we introduced 3 models for enterprise data projects. Those were centralized, federated, and decentralized. So today we're going to be taking a deeper dive into the 2 opposite ends of the spectrum here, the centralized and decentralized models. And then on December 8th, we're going to be focusing on federated models.
Right, and we're actually going to bring in some special guests on that December webinar. We're going to have Ken Nelson and Eileen Battles from the state of Kansas, and they have spent the last 7 or 8 years really standing up an exceptionally strong federated program around the NextGen 911 data set. So we'll be talking with them on December 8th. So hope to see you there for that one.
So for those who don't know us, AppGeo is a geospatial consulting firm. We're based in Boston, Massachusetts, but we do work all over the country in dozens of states. For 30 years now, we've been doing geospatial strategic plans and business plans, application development, database design, database development, system integration, all things geospatial. We've been a longtime sponsor of NSGIC, and we value this community tremendously, and we're really happy to be here today. So thanks for joining us. So as I just mentioned, we've been doing strategic planning for many years now, and altogether we've completed more than 35 enterprise GIS state strategic and business plans across 24 states. Lately, we've really seen a resurgence in this type of work. Just in the past year, we've been working with Richard and Felicia in Texas, with Megan in Indiana, with Aaron in Montana, plus dozens of others in prior years. And it's really not just working with the GIOs in these projects. It's about that outreach to the broader stakeholder community, the other state agencies, the local governments, the private sector companies, the nonprofits, really all of those who participate in and benefit from state GIS coordination. And it's really helped us understand the varying use cases and perspectives and motivations across these different groups. Every state has been different. There are certainly unique challenges and unique opportunities, certainly unique personalities and perspectives there. But what we're seeing is that a common strategic goal, understandably, is to achieve and sustain statewide enterprise data. That might be parcels or addresses or roads, but it's something every state is challenged by, and it really looms large in these plans that we're doing.
Yeah, and Kate, before we get any deeper into this, I think we should just pause briefly for you to introduce yourself, and I'll introduce myself.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Bill. My name's Kate Hickey. I'm our Chief Operating Officer at AppGeo. I've been here for 20 years.
And I'm Bill Johnson. I have the title of Carpe Geo Evangelist at AppGeo. I'm actually part of the marketing team. And I have a history of working in the States. I have a 31-year career history with the state of New York. I was New York's first GIO. So when we talk about these models, I come from the experience of being on the other side of this and having to implement them. And Kate comes from the experience of having worked on strategic plans in more than 20 states where these are a central topic. So that's kind of our background here. All right. getting back to the slide before us, first thing I just want to disavow, this map that you're looking at is not an AppGeo product. I don't know where it came from. That's
Thank
something
you
we
for the
found online.
disclaimer there.
You know, you see Washington, D.C. down between North Carolina and South Carolina, and, you know, Massachusetts is south of Pennsylvania. So anyway, but getting back to the serious topic at hand, yes, Kate, you were talking about every state is faced with these challenges. It's something you've seen time and time again in the strategic plans, and that's absolutely true. What we know now is that the technology for doing these data roll-ups, these enterprise projects, keeps getting better and better. But even with these advances in the tools and the software and data collection and so forth, it's still hard. And in fact, the hardest parts are actually not the tools and the software, it's the non-technical components that we see as being the most challenging. And as we've thought about this and what are those factors, that's really led us to thinking about this framework. And this framework encompasses these three models. And we're going to be talking about how these models deal with roles, governance, funding, the authority structures that underpin these things, data standards, data sharing policies. All of these things have to work in harmony for any of these models to work. And that's what we want to explore with you today.
So the models might not be as fun as playing with these old Tinker Toys, but we did want to use this to illustrate the point that when you understand the various models, and I promise you we will get into those, and you understand the differences between them, and you understand how you can mix and match them, you begin to realize that you perhaps have more options than you initially realized. You know, as Bill was describing, these models provide that framework or that structure to evaluate the efficiency and effectiveness of your current data programs. And then they can also help clarify the trade-offs in choosing one approach over another. No model, you know, is without its pros and cons, and it's good to go into those with eyes wide open. So, you know, we'll get into them a bit more, but as Bill was beginning to describe, the factors that are considered in each are the cost, you know, who shoulders the cost under each of these different models, which might be most cost effective for which types of data layers. Authority, certainly, you know, who's the authoritative data source, who's the funding, who has that funding, and, you know, perhaps to what degree does local control impact the flow of data in these models. And then the implications, which approach is going to result in the greatest consistency for the community, you know, the greatest discoverability and access, the greatest capabilities for the partners that are involved. And then it's also really important to realize that it's not just about you understanding these models. You know, you as a GIO or as a geospatial leader in your state, it's not just about debating them, you know, in a small core group. But it's important for all of your stakeholders to understand the model that they're operating under. It really helps them appreciate their role and their contribution. And it also helps them appreciate why things might break down if they don't participate. So, you know, we'd like to encourage you to use this not just as a intellectual framework, but also as a communication tool.
All right, so here are the three models. We have decentralized on the left, and on the far right, it's polar opposite, centralized, and then something in the middle called federated. And today we're going to concentrate just on the two edges here, the decentralized and the centralized, because the federated model in the middle has enough complexity that it really needs its own treatment, and that's what we're going to be talking about at the webinar on December 8th. But just let me give you a high level, and then we're going to dive deeper into the decentralized and centralized. But basically, in a decentralized model, it's just what you would think from the name, where decisions happen locally. The authority remains local. The funding remains local. And local here doesn't necessarily mean local government. It could be that you're talking about executive branch state agencies, each acting independently. So local, don't confuse local with a level of government here. We're talking about the independent autonomy of agencies working on their own when we talk about decentralized. And decentralized approach is actually quite challenging to be successful with it because it requires everyone on their own to do things consistently, and that generally doesn't happen. So we'll be talking about that in a lot more detail. Let's flip to the far right for a moment and talk about centralized. Here, in a highly centralized model, it's very authoritarian. It's very top-down. You have a single entity making the decisions on behalf of the enterprise. And it's generally centered around a funding source or some legislative authority or something like that that makes it possible. And there's going to be some challenges that we're going to explore about centralized today. But just to tease you a little bit about the federated one in the middle, federated is very, very interesting. It's a kind of a shared authority structure where some of the autonomy is retained locally, and some of the autonomy is via a central authority, and that's really interesting, and that's why it's worth a separate webinar just to break that down, unpack it, talk about how it works and what the ingredients are for success there. So let's move on now, and I think it's important before we dig deep into the decentralized and centralized to think about this as a continuum, because in reality, there are very few examples that we're going to be able to point to that are purely centralized or purely decentralized. So you can think of this as a continuum, and your project can fall really anywhere along that line. And it's kind of interesting because as we unpack this and look at these things, you'll be able to see that you have options to blend elements. In a decentralized thing, you can do things that start to have ingredients of a federated model, for example, and therefore increase the likelihood of being successful with your project by doing so. So when you understand this framework and you understand the flexibility of being able to be anywhere along the line, our hope is that it will give you some new understanding that you actually do have a lot of options, and there are trade-offs that you're making, and understanding those trade-offs, I think, is important as well. Okay, so let's take a deeper dive now on this first one, the one that was on the left, the decentralized model. And here you have the image on the screen here is, what traffic might look like if you had, no central authority, no traffic signals, no rules, no centralized rules around how you drive on the road. So obviously that wouldn't be very effective in the transportation world. But let's think about decentralized in a couple of dimensions. One is you can think of this as this is the default. This is what happens without any active effort to have coordination among either different levels of government or different agencies. And when this goes on, you have every agency or local government essentially siloed. They're each working to meet their own specific needs and requirements. And that doesn't mean they're doing anything wrong. It just means that they are not looking for opportunities to collaborate, opportunities to share. They're focused on their mission and delivering on their mission. And that results in some characteristics that are important to understand. One is that agencies that have stable programs are very often resistant to efforts to coordinate with others because they're going to lose control. They lose the inertia. They might be concerned about liability of accepting someone else's contributions that they're making decisions on. They may feel like that. We have somebody with an open mic here. Okay. I'm sorry. So they might be concerns about losing funding because they may have adequate funding on their own. And there's kind of some unstated competitive issues that sometimes come into play. Everybody's heard of the not invented here syndrome. And I've seen that actually play out in the government sector as well. So this is a local control model. Very often it stays this way because there's lack of a business driver for the state or a group of agencies or a group of locals to want to collaborate and get involved. And those business drivers are something we want to dig in more deeply on.
Yep. And so decentralized is really the default, of course, for a lot of local data like parcels or addresses, which are a local responsibility and have a long history of being maintained and managed at that level. And as Bill mentioned, now there are business drivers that come into play, and there are new business drivers that are pushing these two layers, parcels and addresses, toward a federated or even in some cases a centralized model, particularly with programs like NG911. So yeah, other local data, maybe zoning or water, wastewater infrastructure, those typically remain decentralized because they lack a state business driver that's coming in and pushing them along that continuum. So, just to look at a couple examples, the kinds of projects that align well with the decentralized model are those where the interest or the relevance really is only local. So for instance, as I mentioned, local zoning data, or the local water, wastewater, or even impervious surfaces. Although there are, again, examples, just recently, state of New Jersey, for example, took a statewide top-down approach to statewide impervious surface mapping. So we're seeing that movement across the continuum there. So, we see this decentralized, like local only approach quite a bit with our local government customers as they need to maintain those zoning or those boundaries or special local districts. And a lot of this is because those bylaws, maybe zoning bylaws, they go back hundreds of years in some cases, and they have no relationship with how their neighbor might be maintaining the data or maintaining their zoning bylaws. Here in New England, this is especially true. I think about a small state like Massachusetts, where counties have very little significance in our government. And there are 351 municipalities in this tiny little state here, and they're all maintaining their local zoning data independently with no relationship to their neighbor. If we think about something like parcels, this is a really fascinating one because we begin to see how federal initiatives are sometimes driving these local data sets to make that leap into federated or even centralized data models. It's as states begin to take an interest in managing those features that don't necessarily stop at jurisdictional boundaries. I mean, parcels may have a boundary at the jurisdictional boundary, but the parcels, of course, exist across the entire state. And parcels are a perfect example of this. It's a data set that's natively decentralized, managed at the local level, but there's pressure to move into this broader approach. And part of this leap, of course, is setting data standards, and then there are more and more tools that can be used to implement aggregating data. We're going to get into a bit more of that in part 3 in December when we look at some federated models. But I wanted to call attention to North Dakota because they recently launched a state parcel program, and its goal is to maintain this statewide, accurate, publicly accessible parcel data set. And the local governments are remaining the primary custodians of that parcel data. But as part of the process now, parcel boundaries and that tax roll data are submitted by counties or even just automatically harvested and updated. So, the frequency of those data updates might vary by county, might range from every month to every year. But it's a great example of moving along that continuum from a decentralized model to a federated model. And I know that certainly North Dakota is not the only state doing this. There are many other examples. So.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about how would you make a decentralized approach actually work. And I think this is a case where it's theoretically possible, but I don't have a good example of one of these like a statewide data project that's been done with a completely decentralized approach. It's been successful. And so when we get to the Q&A, if we have anyone in our audience today that has an example like that, I'd invite you to share that with us, because I was struggling to try to come up with a good example here. But let's set that aside for a moment and just talk about what would it take for this approach to really work. And we said that this is a default situation without any coordination. So in actuality, there would be a tiny bit of coordination involved in a truly decentralized approach, and that coordination would be around everyone working towards a common goal or a common set of standards. And so what you have to envision is that you could get all of the, for example, if you were going to do a roll up on a decentralized approach for data that came from local government, you would have to have agreement from everyone at the local government level, each of the municipalities in your state, for example, agreeing to adopt a particular standard on their own, because you're not using any central authority to force it, or you're not backing it up with funding to entice them. So this is a kind of a DIY kind of a approach here, and you would need to be making the case for people to want to do this on their own. And of course, the likelihood is that there are going to be gaps, that because there are differences in capabilities, in resources, in understanding of the tools and all of these things, that there are going to be some locals that probably will not step up to the plate and get it done. And there may be some that believe that it'd be a good thing to do, but just don't, they're already buried under the mandates that they have, and they can't spare time and effort to participate. So there are a variety of hurdles that would have to be overcome here. And so, kind of, if you were going to shift from purely decentralized and just inch a little bit towards centralized, the things it would take are agreement on standards and a funding source that would be available to those locals. I think if those two ingredients could come together, perhaps through a grant program, this could be made to work. But again, I have been struggling to try to identify a great example and just don't have one here. So decentralized, very challenging, and is probably not going to be the focus of how you're going to proceed on a statewide project. But understanding these little nuances of them may help you in picking out the pieces of the other parts of the continuum to apply to move something out of this kind of a stagnant state into something more active. And that gives us a good transition point to now let's flip our perspective from the decentralized end and go clear to the other end of this spectrum, to our centralized.
Okay, I can talk a little bit about that and some of the characteristics when you go to the other end of the spectrum there. So in a centralized model, there's a single data source that's been identified, and that is the benefit there, of course, to ensure consistent authoritative data, kind of like the centralized factory and that revolutionary assembly line of the Ford Motor days. It's really an economies of scale model. It's all about efficiency here. And in terms of authority and command structure, this is absolutely a top-down model that is required to make this work. The authority really cannot be shared, not effectively at least. A GIO might get input from others, but really the decision and the operation, it resides in that one entity. And of course, not surprisingly, the funding determines who has that authority. We go to the golden rule there. He or she who holds the gold makes the rules. So often the authority and the funding go hand in hand there. And often what we see in these centralized approaches is is there's typically a strong and sometimes an urgent business driver. It might be something like NextGen 911 or broadband mapping, or even more recently, the COVID case mapping throughout a state. Certainly there were urgent demands coming from those in authority saying this needs to happen now. And those are what's causing a state to take an active role in creating that data with a very centralized, efficient, top-down approach. So, I wanted to dig into some of those business drivers. We keep talking about those, Bill, but I thought it might be helpful for you to share some of your experience as a GIO in New York and talk about some of the challenges that you experienced with centralized data projects.
Absolutely. And I have to just say, I love the images you found for these slides, Kate. And I guess that's a 1950s gym class.
Yes, thank goodness they're not that way anymore.
All right. So first of all, centralization isn't just going to happen on its own. It's going to happen because that authority has been brought into play, and it's overcoming a whole bunch of things. And I think of the kinds of the categories of things that might have to be overcome would include things like the inertia of current activities. And inertia is a surprisingly strong force in government. When programs are up and running and they're considered stable, it can be very hard to dislodge those. You might come in as an outsider and say, "Oh, look at that! They're using old data, or that does, there are better ways to approach it. We could use GIS and improve the efficiency of that if we could just get them to change." And they might naively think it'll be easy to convince people because I've got a better idea here. And those often run into a brick wall because the agency that's got a stable program for a variety of reasons will not want to disrupt that because it's considered risky and disruptive to do that. And in addition to that, when you talk about shifting to a centralized approach, you're asking the other participants to yield control, to yield authority. And to the extent they have any of that already, that loss of control, that loss of authority, loss of decision-making ability is another hurdle that can be very hard to overcome. And attached to that, you may be inadvertently or even deliberately interrupting an existing funding stream. And so if an organization already has a stable source of funding feeding a program, and you're asking them to change the program in a way that may impact their eligibility to use those funds, they're naturally going to want to resist on that basis as well. So there are lots of dimensions that you have to understand going into as you approach partners to work with you on a centralized project. And one further challenge, I think, in instituting a centralized approach here is that you're trying to impose a new level of order on something that may be, we'll just say, disorganized. That doesn't mean it's, scattershot. It means that things are happening independently, and you're trying to add a layer of organization that was not there before. And so there are challenges there too, because that requires, kind of the sorting of the pecking order and all of that. So these are real dimensions that you have to understand when you're going to approach a centralized project.
I'm sure many of the people on this call have experienced some of those barriers, and I'm wondering if you have any advice for how they might overcome them or face these barriers, get through them.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the main thing is to identify a business driver. We're going to talk a little bit more about business drivers here, I think probably on the next slide maybe, or a little further down. But business drivers are the way, I think, are the primary way to overcome these barriers. Because a business driver, what it means is there's been some identified priority that's at a higher level than any of the participants. And it can come from a variety of places. It could be a regionally organized priority. in New York, where I spent much of my career, there are defined economic development zones, and there's a program that where these economic development zones compete annually for funding from the state economic development agency. And so there's a kind of this regional competition, and that can rally cooperation around the counties in that region, for example. Or it might be a business driver coming from an initiative from the governor or from the state legislature. And those are very powerful because, you know, the governor, of course, oversees all the executive branch agencies and can impose that authority. And likewise, the legislature can implement laws that place specific requirements and burdens on local governments as well. So that's another place where you might see these business drivers. Or there may be federal program activities, especially ones that involve funding to the states. That can be a business driver, and there it's more carrot than stick. If you want this funding, you know, we need you to do X, Y, and Z, and it may involve creation of data that requires, you know, some state stewardship. We see that in a number of activities from federal agencies, or it could even come from non-government programs. You know, good government groups, philanthropic organizations. They oftentimes promote projects. The Bloomberg Philanthropy, for example, has a program to help cities advance in the digital age. They have a whole program around that where they provide seed money to do that. There's just one example. Pew Charitable Trusts works on a national scale. Right now, they're very active in broadband, and they're doing studies around broadband. So there are these good government groups that and philanthropic orgs that can provide that business driver.
And in your experience, do these business drivers, do they actually affect behavior and affect outcomes?
Well, they can, yeah. And the way that works is that people that are looking at these business drivers are making decisions. They're weighing what they would get out of it, the what's in it for me. I think everybody on some level sees the greater good of participating in a collaborative project. But at the end of the day, the decision point, the really critical part of the decision point often comes down to what's in it for me. And so, yeah, if you're the person trying to organize one of these centralized activities, you really have to have an answer for that. What are they going to gain that is going to improve the outcomes for them, or reduce burden on them, or open up additional possibilities outside the immediate scope of the project because the data supports a number of other use cases? You have to have an answer to that "what's in it for me" question. And very often, too, these business drivers involve a funding model where it might be partial level of funding. So it's, you know, you can consider it a, you know, matching grant where there's either a cash or an in-kind services match to the funds, or it might be only a very small portion of seed money. Sometimes just a small amount of seed money will be enough to kickstart the project and get it going, and doesn't require a sustained funding commitment. You just kind of got to get that in motion, get that inertia that we talked about early started. And inertia is, again, a very powerful force in government. And another thing that can work is to change behaviors is grant programs. Very often is an opportunity to work with the granting agency to help them define requirements that those accepting the funds have to comply with certain requirements. And you can, for example, build in the adoption of a data standard as a requirement if you're going to accept this funding in this grant program. So those are all ways to change behavior, Kate.
Mm-hmm. Those are great. I think let's look at some specific examples too of centralized data. I think the most obvious one is imagery. Many states are approaching this in a centralized manner. You know, it's fits really well because when you're going to go do a major contract, when you're looking for those economies of scale, a centralized approach often works best, and it really gives the state that buying power of a single contract there, a lot more negotiation power. And it's very costly for counties to be producing their own imagery. In my career, I've watched small cities and counties spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce imagery, and now it's a not much more for an entire state to be doing this on a regular basis. So. Not to mention that, doing it piecemeal throughout a state creates lots of other problems, flights at different times, different resolution, maybe different tiling schemes or different radiometric characteristics. These all create problems when trying to look at imagery statewide. And there are lots of use cases for why you would want to look at this snapshot in time across the entire state. So, looking at an extreme example, a big state like Texas. So they have a centralized imagery program, 254 counties, 268,000 square miles. They moved to a centralized imagery program in 2015, and they're serving it up through our Giza imagery streaming platform. And they are serving hundreds of thousands of users, and the ROI for them is enormous. So, they're spending quite a bit to purchase this imagery, but when you look at the cost savings across all of those counties and the value that it's delivering to all of those users, it's hugely valuable.
Yeah, and I'm kind of chuckling to myself because I was involved in the imagery program in the state of New York where I worked, and we thought that was a big state. It's about 50,000 square miles. And so an imagery program with more than 5 times the square mileage in Texas is just kind of mind-boggling because it was a lot of work to manage a program for 50,000 square miles. So yeah, imagery is a great example. And really, when I think centralized, my head immediately goes to any kind of a data project where you're going to want to do a big statewide contract. Mm-hmm. If it's going to be a statewide contract, you're really going to want to deal with it under the centralized model and be thinking your way through those barriers that we talked about earlier. But back to imagery, I think there's another dimension here that's worth touching on, and that's the way the imagery market has really shifted a lot in the last decade. And it's really moved from having to contract for imagery flown to your specifications that you will own and distribute and manage and do all the things to make it available to your community. The market has really come a long way now, and now we're in a kind of an imagery on demand market model, these content programs. And those have brought a lot of cost advantages too that have got states rethinking their strategies around imagery. But it still involves this centralized model. It still involves getting the partners to contribute to a pot of money and doing one contract. The management of how the imagery is handled might be much less burdensome on a state under these programs. But the basics of a centralized model and the benefits of a centralized model are just as potent with a content program as they are with a custom contracting kind of a model.
So another example that probably most people on this call are certainly familiar with is the LiDAR elevation data. So the 3DEP program, the USGS program, where LiDAR elevation is done to the program specs, but this is happening at a nationwide level here.
Yeah, so this is really interesting because it's kind of a 2-tiered centralized model. So it's a national program, but it's managed state by state. And the way this works is USGS leads the program. They have the contracting vehicle. So states that participate in the program are really kind of an agent to USGS, and USGS actually executes all the contracts, manages that, does the QA on the data, and then the states, coordinate requirements on the ground, their portion of the funding, and then they help make it available to the users in their state. So it's a really interesting program and a very successful one. But what I like about it is it's the only one that I can really point to immediately that's a 2-tiered centralized model, not really federated. I guess it's a little bit it's shifted a little bit from the purely centralized because of this two-tier element, but it doesn't retain any of the shared authority that you have with a truly federated project.
And then another interesting example is with site structure addresses, and there's some nuances at the tiers here as well.
Yeah, so here, NextGen 911 is the business driver, and that's a very powerful business driver. And we're seeing a lot of examples around the country of data that's now being driven by this next generation 911 business driver. Of course, that's a change to the way the next gen 911 systems operate. It's a shift to a GIS-based call routing function. And NENA, the National Emergency Numbering Association, is the one that has developed all the standards for that GIS data and a data model to support those standards. And so people are now using that to rally around building these data sets. And there's a number of examples where states are building a federated approach to do the next gen 911 work. And in fact, that's why we're going to be talking to the folks from Kansas at our December webinar. But this summer, I did some research, and I took the National 911 Status Report. They publish at the end of every year. The most recent one that's still available right now is the 2019. The 2020 one will be available by the end of December, because it takes them a year to collect the data, and then they use another year to clean it up and publish it. But what that study has is over 100 questions that they ask the states to report on about the status of their 911 activities. And there's a group of questions in that annual report about the GIS data. And what I did is I looked at the most recent one, and identified the 6 states that were reporting the highest level of completion on the GIS data sets. And I called all 6 of them to ask about how they were doing the work, what was their strategy around provisioning these data sets. Turns out that 5 of those 6 states are in New England. And in 4 of those 5 states, they're using a highly centralized approach for building the site structure address database. The 6th state was Kansas, and Kansas was at the other end. They were using a totally federated approach, and very, very interesting. And that's because of the conversations we had around that. I have a lot more familiarity with the Kansas approach now, which is why we're going to be inviting them next month. But really interesting to see that the New England states, where it's smaller and more compact, and where it's a flatter governmental structure, counties really do not have a meaningful role in New England. So it's really the state 911 office dealing directly with the locals. And I think that has led to this centralization model for site structure address points for next gen 911. And I know, Kate, you know a lot more about how the Massachusetts model works, right?
Yeah, we've watched that play out in our backyard here in Massachusetts. They took a centralized approach to creating this address point data. So it was funded by the state 911 office, and the points were derived from statewide parcels. So interestingly, the need for addresses became a business driver for statewide parcels as well, which certainly benefited the Commonwealth. So it's derived from these parcels and statewide structures as well. And now the data are maintained centrally in the MassGIS office. They're getting regular input from local cities and towns, but nobody except the MassGIS staff are actually editing the data. So truly all the edits to that data are made in a centralized, controlled fashion at MassGIS.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I know from talking to Vermont and Maine and Connecticut as well, that's the way that's working in those states also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes you think about, the size of the state is not one of the factors we presented here, but certainly, the ability to scale to a centralized model probably has a lot to do with the state and the structure and how many features you're talking about here.
Right, right. All right, so I think we're going to just shift now back to the middle portion of this continuum and give you a little bit of a teaser about where we're going with the upcoming one. But also we want to talk about how this stuff can map out to the national level geospatial data activities. So I think that's where we want to talk next, Kate, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so, we touched on imagery, elevation, addresses, 3 of these framework data layers. But it's worth mentioning how the others might align with these data governance models as well. So, take transportation, for instance. A federated model would likely align best, as data sets are often created locally, but the state is providing that direction and facilitating that roll up to a state level. With the FHWA Arnold program, the state DOT must coordinate with those local governments and include the local roads in an annual GIS data submission that goes to FHWA. Historically, the state DOT was more focused on just the state and federal highway systems, but Arnold creates that business driver and the requirement for them to coordinate with locals and include that data. So it's interesting how it's affected behavior in that manner.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think another example of a federated one is geodetic control. What we have modernization happening now with the geodetic control networks. And the way that works is it's a national program. It's led by the National Geodetic Survey, part of the Department of Commerce. And they do that by working with the states. NGS doesn't go out and survey every point that's in these geodetic networks. It's done in cooperation with the states and the surveying communities in those states. So they have a very active role in how those shifts are going to be realized in the states, the zoning and all the things that go around creating these new networks.
So I know we want to be able to get to some questions and a little discussion, but we just also want to point out that we've been talking a lot about the state perspective, but it's really important to expand the view when we're talking about these data governance models. Expand the view to a national one where there are business drivers that are impacting data governance models, such as NAD, the National Address Database, the resurgence in broadband mapping, the Geospatial Data Act, the next generation of NSDI. Getting these data governance models right is really going to determine the success of NSDI. So go ahead, Bill.
No, I was just going to say, I totally agree with you. And in particular, the success of this implementation of the Geospatial Data Act is going to require participation by all levels of government. So it's really begging in many instances for a strong federated model. And so that's, again, we're leading up to, I think, a really interesting set of conversations coming up on December 8th. I do want to pause before we take questions here. I think it's really interesting you mentioned broadband. And broadband is one there's been a shift in strategy at the national level. Many of you remember that there was an Economic Recovery Act pot of money from 2009 to 14 that resulted in a grant program from the NTIA to each of the states to do broadband mapping. And in fact, that's how the original national broadband map was created. It was a federated model. States actually led the work in their state with funding from NTIA to do the work. And when that program ended in 2014, the FCC changed their reporting requirements and took on the resumption of the broadband mapping. So the state's role in producing the 50 pieces of jigsaw puzzle, if you will, that created the national broadband map, that shifted to FCC collecting the data directly from the broadband carriers on their own. So it's very interesting. There was one that went from a successful federated model to a totally centralized model. And they're modernizing that now, but it's going to remain a centralized model. It will involve direct reporting of the carriers to the FCC in a better way than has been going on for the last decade, but it's still going to be centralized.
That's a really interesting example. So how about we wrap up our presentation, Bill, and I think we'll have time for a few questions. So December 8th, come back. We're going to go deeper into the federated models with our friends from Kansas. And if you have any questions that you don't get to ask here, feel free to email Bill or me. Our emails are on the screen here.
Yeah, so fire away. And by the way, a reminder, if anybody out there has a great example to share of a successful, fully decentralized data build that's happened on a statewide scale, I'd love to have you share that, because like I said, I couldn't think of one. It's one that the theory is there, but the practical application of it eludes me.
Well, thank you, Kate and Bill, for that wonderful presentation. We'll now take questions in the chat box. Our first question comes a comment actually from Tracy. One of my favorite phrases I use is, we have no technical problems, because the business decisions that have to be made make anything technical seem simple. We have a question from Jason. Where can we access this list of competition by state?
I'm sorry, access what?
Complete a list of completion by state?
Yes, where can we access this list of completion? And Jason, would you like to come, if you're comfortable, would you like to come off and ask to kind of elaborate?
Completion of addresses.
Oh,
okay. I think he just clarified in the chat here. So, well, the completion of addresses, so I'm wondering if it's a question about how the state is approaching it, the governance model by state, or the national address database, those who are contributing to the NAD.
Yeah,
the
if it's
database is
okay.
Basically that list. You said there were 6, and I just want to know, where is that comprehensive list that just says who's doing the best and who's lagging? Okay,
that was not the national address database. That was the National 911 report. So from 911.gov is the URL to the National 911 office. They have a lot of reports and studies and different things on there, but they also have annually, they do a data collection. They do it through a third party, which is, what's the name of that association? It's basically the State 911 Coordinators Association, and the acronym is eluding me at the moment here. But they basically, that is a survey. NASNA, thank you, the National Association of State 911 Directors. Yes, NASNA.
David Lucas gets credit for that one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. And so the National 911 Office asks the NASNA members to complete this survey, and then they have to process all the survey responses and aggregate the results, and then it gets published at the end of the following year as the National 911 Status Report, and it covers a lot of ground. It's a like 150-page report, and there's a lot of maps and graphics in there as well. And there were a body of questions in there about the GIS data sets. And so I had gone, it was deep in that report. It was probably 2/3 of the way into the report before I found the particular question that asked the states to report on. It's self-reported on the level of completion of their GIS data to support NextGen 911. And that's where I got the 6 states that I called.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another question from Joshua Greenberg. I was wondering if you have created a list of incentives, motivations for centralized data participation.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion there. I mean, we certainly haven't compiled that list, but you're giving me a great idea for maybe a white paper on the topic, with some of this guidance here, because I know that, there's a lot of guidance out there on data governance models, but I think in terms of geospatial and getting into these non-technical parts of data governance, right? Like we hear a lot about the tools that can help with these data rollups, and there are lots of great technology options out there. But thinking about the incentives and the behavioral changes, I haven't seen a comprehensive list of that. So maybe,
yeah, but I can
Bill,
tell you,
we should put that together.
yeah, and the number one carrot on that list is going to be money, of course.
Yeah.
That shouldn't be any surprise. I mean,
Yeah.
you dangle funding in front of potential partners. That's the best way to get cooperation. And it's always surprised me that it does. You don't have to dangle a lot of money to get people. People don't want to walk away from money, even if it's a small amount, even if it only represents a fraction of what it's going to take for them to meet their obligation under a coordination program.
Right.
It's just I don't know. Nobody wants to be the one that says, I refuse to take that money. You were dangling money in front of me and I said no.
It's interesting, in Massachusetts, again, when they were creating the statewide parcels, there was funding, but the funding was actually going directly to vendors to support standardized parcel data and submit that data on a regular basis, because so many of the communities were using vendors to manage their parcel data. So it was actually kind of cutting the local governments out of the loop. I mean, they were participating. They said, sure, you can, maintain our data to a particular standard. It doesn't make any difference to us. But then the vendors were benefiting. You could argue that was economic stimulus, economic development in the Commonwealth, and the state had fewer entities to coordinate with. So that was another interesting model there.
Mm.
So it looks like we have time for one more question. This is from Becky. Any revisions, improvements pending for the Geospatial Data Act?
Well, I don't believe there's any legislative amendments, if that's what you're referring to. So the Geospatial Data Act, was passed 2 years ago, and it was actually not a standalone bill. It was attached to an FAA reauthorization piece of legislation, which is kind of interesting the way that got passed. And the Federal Geographic Data Committee's role gets expanded under the GDA, as everybody refers to it. And so there's a lot of thinking going on right now with the FGDC and their kind of sister organization, the National Geospatial Advisory Council, the NSGIC, which pre-GDA was purely advisory to the FGDC. But what they're doing now to implement the act is rethinking the governance model around how this is going to work to really be effective to build the national spatial data infrastructure. What is that governance model? And I know NSGIC is very active on this front, and along with the members of the FGDC, the Federal Geographic Data Committee, and the NGAC, the National Geospatial Advisory Council. But I'm not aware of any effort to revise the act or do legislative amendments. There may be some talk about that, but I'm not aware of it.
Well, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. Well, I want to say first off, thank you so much to Bill and Kate for this incredible presentation. And if anyone in the audience has questions that you did not answer, their contact information is on the slide, but you can also submit your questions to info@nsgic.org, and I'd be happy to pass them along. And thank you to everyone for attending today.
Thank you. Come back on December 8th.
Yes, right. Hopefully everyone comes back on December. And the recording, I just saw Kim, the recording for everyone will be available soon, most likely next week. You will get that email, so be on a lookout for an email of this recording of the webinar.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, guys. Everyone have a good day.
All right, bye now.